First of all, just this is our records modernization workshop number 4. You can see the previous ones that we've done on the right-hand side of the slide. We will send you a copy of this presentation after the event. And so when you get it, these links will be live and you can take a look at those recordings if those topics are of interest to you. Also, any of the links that Katy mentions during the course of her presentation, they will be live as well. And I should say that this whole series is sponsored by Quality Associates. Some of their contacts are on the left-hand side of the slide. If you're not familiar with QAI, they're basically a leading provider of end-to-end services and solutions for document management, imaging, and records management. And they essentially take all of that unorganized and unstructured printed and electronic data and turn it into business intelligence. They're based in Fulton, Maryland. They have extensive experience in the federal government, but also in other sectors like state and local and manufacturing, law firms, that sort of thing. And I do appreciate them basically giving me free rein to do whatever I want with this records modernization series. And hopefully this is of use to everyone. And if you like it, please feel free to share the links in the future with your friends and colleagues. And also share this presentation when you get it with your friends and colleagues. So let me, as I say, I am the former president. That's a very lofty title I gave myself down there, President Emeritus of AIM. It sounds like something from a university setting. I was president of AIM for about 25 years, so I'm well acquainted with some of the issues that my friends in the records management community face when it comes to trying to convince people up the chain that this is an important issue. I'm also the author of a book that talks about the role of records in a personal search that I had for my grandparents. And Katy, I'll allow you to introduce yourself and then we'll get started.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. I'm Katy Perry. I will not be making the presentation by song. So if you are hoping to chime in and sing along, that's not going to happen today. I am a management consultant and principal of KMP Consulting, LLC. Really, more importantly, I am a former Fed, having spent 37 years in the federal sector, working for various agencies, primarily at the NIH. My several positions, a lot of them dealing with records management. I don't think there is a position in government where you don't deal with records management. So I've learned a lot along the way, and now I am supporting agencies and organizations in large-scale organizational changes, records management, privacy, and other functional areas. So today, I would like to just kind of walk through a few considerations regarding managing records in an electronic environment. And John, if it's okay, I think we can get started.
That'd be terrific. I'm going to put myself on mute while you speak, Katy. And so if I come back in and you see my mouth moving, but not my the voice coming, then let me know. As you can tell, I have a bit of a tickle in my throat, so I just don't want to cough at any point along the way. And so this is really pretty exciting because, as you recall from this previous slide, we spent a lot of time talking about the new federal digitization standards, but that's only part of the challenge that people have. And Katy's going to walk us through all the other things that you all have to worry about as you think about your records modernization strategy.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I mean, there's no way in 30 minutes we'll be able to get through everything. So I have reached out to a number of colleagues that manage records both in the public and private sector. And I said, talk to me about your pain points. What are the things that you would want to know about? What are the things that your stakeholders may not be aware of? So in this slide, basically, I'm just going to take you through looking at today, some things we can do now in records management to support the organization, a brief look at the deadlines, some considerations regarding the digitization requirements, both for temporary and permanent records, and then unstructured data. We're going to delve into that a bit, and records management and the system development life cycle, along with some very, very solid policies and information from NARA regarding universal electronic records management, as well as a framework that they've created, and then ending with what's next. So if you have questions along the way, I encourage you to put them in the chat. And then at the end, we'll have a few minutes, hopefully, to answer questions or at least guide you to the resource that could help you. Next slide, please. So we're excited, depending on where you are in the maturity of your records management program, that you're waving the flag saying, great, we've digitized things. Now what? The first thing I think that you really should consider is going back and taking a look at the agency or organization record schedules and file plans. Some people moved quickly to start digitizing records across the organization, but you have to look and make sure that the record schedules are media neutral and allow for digitization. You may have some old schedules that still are not media neutral and only in paper format. So this is a good opportunity to take a look at the schedules. If you're using the NARA General Records Schedule or GRS, those are media neutral, and go ahead and move forward to start developing file plans. The next thing is to conduct a file analysis for your ROT records. So those are the redundant, obsolete, and transitory records. As you moved forward to start the digitization process, think about if you really reached out to say, let's take a look at, this particular budget report or an annual report or some other record you were digitizing. 7 offices may have had that record, which means 7 offices digitized that record. So you want to really start the cleanup effort based on the first role of digitization for your organization. The next thing is make records training mandatory, not just as part of onboarding and not just for federal staff. This would be for your trainees, for your contractors, for your summer students, and others that come on, whether it's permanent, part-time, intermittent. This is a management control where you are able to inform people about the do's and don'ts of records management in the organization, and then conduct yearly refresher training sessions, updating it with content that's relevant or with initiatives that your records managers are going to be working on. The other thing is be at the table. A lot of people say, oh, no, we've got the records covered. We've already talked about that with our IT professionals. We've done privacy impact assessments. Records managers and representatives need to be at the table, not at the end when the system is being rolled out, not at the end where a system is being retired. You have to be there in the beginning. So you have to form those relationships and coalitions, if you will, to be part of the team. And then be creative in communicating things. Records management isn't something that people say, wow, tell me more. So you really want to take the opportunity to try communicating, whether it's in newsletters, information sessions. And finally, because so many people are still remote, take a walk. Go to some of the physical spaces at your agency or organization. You will be really surprised how many paper records are still just sitting around. Next slide, please. So the federal folks that are on the call today are very, very familiar with what was once called M1921. Now we're calling it M2307. This slide is really meant just as a reference document for you, and it just showcases the 3-page memo and what the due dates are. So as you can see from the slide, we have less than a year to be compliant with the requirements for NARA. Just keep in mind as you're looking at this, if your agency has an agency-operated record storage facility, that shuts down by June 30th of next year. If you want to or you need to continue using commercial storage facilities, make sure those are NARA compliant. Please don't use the easy storage facility down the road. That's not compliant. Next slide, please. So the last couple of sessions, in this series, we really did a deep dive into the digitization standards. I just wanted a slide again for reference purposes. The presentation is meant not just to inform, but to serve as a reference guide for you. When you think of permanent records, the key takeaway is look at the FADG guidelines. The FADG 3-star guidelines are set the parameters so that you will be compliant with the digitization requirements for permanent records. Next slide, please. Now, permanent records make up 3 to 5% of your agency's records, so think about everything else. Everything else is a temporary record. So there are regulations guiding digitization standards for your temporary records. They're a little bit different, but there's one thing to keep in mind. When you look at your record schedules, you may have records with a retention of 20 years plus. You may have records that maybe the disposition schedule is 7 years, but you continue to have a business need and you retain those records. You may have some that are part of litigation hold. So as you're considering the digitization standards you want to put in place for temporary records, also think about the length of time you'll be keeping those records. As you can see by a lot of these slides that we're going through already, I have included links to either the CFR regulations or to the NARA sites. Next slide, please. So last week, I was in a meeting with a number of records colleagues, and I said, you know, I'm going to be talking about electronic records. We're not going to fit the everything else because I don't know that one person or one organization knows the everything else. But I said, what is the pain point for you? What are the things that concern you about records management? And an agency records officer said 2 words, unstructured data. I was like, okay, and actually that makes a lot of sense. So I really wanted to kind of get into that a little bit and talk about unstructured data. For IT professionals, for records officers, unstructured data might be very, very clear. But for some of your stakeholders, they're probably not thinking about unstructured data. They might be creating records. Hey, it's in a SharePoint site, got it on a share drive, it's fine. That's great, but it's not in a structured database format. How do you retrieve it? How are you safeguarding the information? Unstructured data is something really, really important to bring to the forefront of electronic records management and the protection of this important information. Additionally, there are requirements. Of course, we're in the government, so there are requirements that agencies must manage unstructured electronic records in a record-keeping system that meets the requirements within this particular law. What that means is, next slide, please. These are some of the management controls for e-systems. So this specifically talks about the records controls that have to be put in place. And this is what I mean by you have to be at the table. As you are talking about implementing electronic record-keeping systems, what are the things that you need to look for? And so these are the 7 controls that you need to keep in mind. So if an office or a division or program area wants to move forward, let's say they want to use a COPS product or commercial off-the-shelf product, are there controls in place that align with the requirements or regulations? Next slide, please. Then being a part of the system development life cycle is really critical for records managers. I want to touch on the fact, not just the agency records officer. I have worked with records officers in very, very large agencies. They don't know every single system that is being created. They don't know at the office or division level. They're not necessarily involved. So there are record liaisons, record custodians, other record representatives that need to be aware of this. You could have administrative staff that have a role in records management for their office. And then they find out through a budget meeting, oh, we need to create a new system to manage these records. So that should be a trigger to say, may I sit in on these meetings? And then touch base with the records officer, see what the controls are that are needed. Be a part of this life cycle at the beginning, not at the end. Additionally, if there is a system that will sunset or retire, get a formal disposition plan in place. I cannot tell you how many times I have either seen, heard, engaged with people that say, oh, the system is going down. I saw an email saying, oh, in 3 months, we've completed beta testing. In 3 months, we're going to convert to a new system. Well, what about those records, that are residing in the existing system? How would we be able to retrieve them? Are there any of those records impacted by litigation hold? Or is it part of an investigation? Is it part of a FOIA request? These are things that, from an IT perspective may be considered, but not always. So again, it's really important for the records people to be at the table. The second piece is determining if a records impact assessment is needed. For those of you on this session that are involved in records management, you may also have a role in your agency regarding privacy. I know many records people that are also either privacy officers or privacy representatives. In the area of privacy, agencies are required to submit privacy impact assessments if there will be PII, PHI, or sensitive information going into the system. That's great because then you can capture a lot of things. But what about a records impact assessment? There are several agencies that I've talked to that are looking into developing formal records impact assessments. While you may not want to do something formal, I think it's good to try to set something up so you can analyze how these records are going to be managed, safeguarded, what the disposition will be, if there's a continued business need beyond the record schedule, if they need to be tagged and held for litigation hold, or continued business need. The continued business need is really a big deal because you want to make sure, especially in the areas of research or emerging or evolving initiatives, you want to make sure you don't lose the information. And then you formally document the issues and implications while you're working, not just with the IT people, but with the offices and organizations that need the system. Next slide, please. So these are some additional requirements. I was meeting with a colleague yesterday and he kind of chuckled when he saw this slide, which I thought was actually kind of funny. Declare those records, capture the records. Okay, you don't have to be in records management to know that these requirements are kind of, important. But again, through what's in the CFR and what's available through NARA, there are a lot of really, really decent pages, requirements, information, guidance available. So again, trying to pull all of this information, keep in mind the importance of these requirements because that's going to drive the solution that you are going to adopt. Next slide, please. So NARA has done a fabulous job getting information together. However, you would have to probably work full-time to go through each and every page that NARA has. And I have spent quite a bit of time. I actually wanted to pull this particular screenshot out because this is a great page and I've got the link to it as well. For electronic records modernization, they've got some really good information. I just thought it might be a little bit easier to provide this to you along with the link versus going down the rabbit hole and trying to find it. Because again, there's so much good information, but sometimes it's just too much to take in at one time. So what we're going to talk about in the remaining slides is, touching on the universal electronic records management requirements, as well as a framework that NARA put together. Next slide, please. So NARA has taken the electronic management life cycle and broken it out to create the requirements, starting with capture all the way to disposal and reporting. So this is a really good model as you are setting up the requirements for your organization. The other important piece is, because records management, it's on TV, let's get real. There's a lot going on in records management, but it's not something that agencies are just throwing money at. So as records officials or stakeholders or people involved in records management, you have to really think about, what can I do to show the importance of records so that you give me resources so that I can get what I need? Are there requirements? Is it the law? Well, what's going to happen if I don't do it? Am I going to NARA jail? Well, maybe you're not going to NARA jail, but as an organization or agency, if you want to be compliant, then you really want to look at what the requirements are, look at what the guidelines are. And so this really kind of maps out the requirements. When you go to the site, to the NARA site, it actually has, NARA's done a really good job mapping out requirements in spreadsheets for each of these areas. So you can go to one of the 6 areas and look, okay, under the area of capture, what are the requirements? And does it apply to all areas of the life cycle or just 1 or 2 particular areas? Next slide, please. This is probably one of the best subsites that NARA has. And it took me a while to find it actually, because I haven't really, at least with the people that I've been working with, it's not something that I have, let's say, engaged with quite a bit and to some degree of detail. But there is a framework that they've put together, this Federal Integrated Business Framework for Electronic Records Management. And this is actually good stuff here, because this is the framework to really help you identify the IT solutions out there and how you can align what your needs are, the data standards, the key activities, the inputs, the outputs, the data elements that you need. And through the information in this framework really helps you to better engage, have dialogue with your stakeholders, with your IT investors, and with vendors who are coming to you with solutions. So again, these are not answers to the questions that you have about records management in an electronic environment, but more so important considerations, things that you really need to think about as you're developing strategies. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, in the seminar series, the first presentation was by NARA's Director of Policy, Lisa Haralampis. Lisa is amazing. I mean, she just gets that information out there in a way that is understandable, digestible, and actionable. She had focused on 4 focus areas that NARA is really going to put a lot of attention to. So in looking ahead, think about aligning your agencies or organizations' record priorities and actions with NARA's focus areas. And those would be applying the digitization standards for temporary and permanent records. And really, it's not just the permanent records. Think about those temporary records, because there's so much information that is being created. And then emails, e-messages, and Capstone. A lot of agencies have adopted Capstone for email. which is great because then you don't have to tease out every email and determine if it's a record and apply an appropriate disposition schedule. You have capstone officials where those emails are permanent, and your non-capstone officials. Most of your agency staff will be non-capstone officials. If you adopt capstone for your organization or agency, makes managing the emails a little bit easier. Then records created on collaborative platforms and universal ERM requirements. We did touch a little about the universal requirements, but this is not just collaborative platforms. It's really an opportunity to look at what might be working in other organizations. And it depends, again, on the maturity of your agency or organization related to records management initiatives. And then document internal controls you plan to put in place to mitigate risks. Oh, and I forgot, I'm so sorry. The oversight and reporting requirements to NARA, the RMSAs and SORM annual reports. Take the information from there and use it as opportunities, either for improvement or as opportunities to ask for resources to address some of the areas that you want to focus on. Going back now to the second bullet, documenting internal controls you plan to put in place to mitigate risk. Risk management is a big deal, and risk management really is something that you can use to get the resources. I can't tell you how many times in looking at the risk inventory that I had for my division when I was in government, using that if-then approach. If we don't do this, then it will, something will happen. I'm not saying something bad will happen, the world will end, but if you incorporate risk management, it really helps you to identify the importance of either moving forward with initiative or getting the resources that you need. The third bullet is establish a plan that every 5 years, agencies must review all record schedules that are 10 years and older based on the date NARA approved the schedule. Actually, that is a requirement. I don't know if anybody picked up on that, if anybody cares about that, but it is something that you definitely need to keep on the radar as you're looking at cyclical activities for your organization. And then the last piece is team up with other agency records officers, build that network, build that coalition, because you never know what someone else is doing that you could adopt and find out what are the pain points, what are the lessons learned, what are the best practices. If you can reach out and really expand the network beyond just your agency, you'd be surprised at how much you could learn that you can take back to your organization. Next slide. That's it in a nutshell, and I'm hopeful there are some questions that I'm hopeful I can answer.
There sure are, and while some of the additional questions are piling up, and please feel free to post them and we'll get to as many as possible as we can. Again, if you have any questions in this area that you'd like to chat about offline, I'll leave these contacts on the left-hand side up, as well as contact Katy if you have any questions. We'd be happy to talk more about some of these challenges moving forward. Before hopping into the question, I want to make one comment, or a couple comments, particularly about the digitization standards for federal records. One is just a little blip that everybody should be aware of, because it took me a while to understand what was going on, is that when those standards and regulations were being developed, they pretty much moved in lockstep, the regulation with a FAGI revision of the third version of FAGI standards in terms of defining what 3-star is, for example. And so everything went in lockstep, lockstep, lockstep. And then at the last minute, there was a slight disconnect in one of the parameters associated with digitization quality. And I believe it has to do with color. And it basically, FAGI elevated the standard from what's technically in the regulation. So my guidance there, if anybody starts raising that, like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? Download the FADGI guidelines and look there, because you're best off going against that rather than necessarily that one little blip in the regulation. The second thing I just wanted to talk about is that Kevin DeVorsey spent some time on his presentation a couple of weeks ago, talking about the fact that federal records are not just federal records. People tend to glom this all into one big bucket. There are presidential records that's governed by one set of authorities, and we won't go into some of the details associated with that. There are federal records and there are congressional records. So, make sure when you're talking to people, they know kind of what they're talking about along the way. And then the third thing I wanted to emphasize from Katy's comments, which I think is really good, is this, those new standards and those new regs apply to digitization of permanent records. And that's really only 3 to 5% of the total records that are created. And then there's sort of the everything else, which essentially operates, if you were in the private sector, you'd say according to general best business practices. And so my first question to you, Katy, is that, okay, you're in an agency, you've got a gazillion boxes floating around, you're trying to figure out how to digitize them. What's going to happen as people think about those two different levels of quality standards? Are they going to sort out, or are they going to default to the higher standard? What's your speculation on what might happen?
I think, initially people aren't really thinking about it, but, I was thinking, what's the key takeaway in all this? And it's really just sharing information and awareness. And that's what's going to answer the question that you just asked. So if people understand that they have temporary records, let's just say that you're working in a technology transfer office and your records retention for the records that you're creating are 20 years. Then if you have the awareness of particular standards that are adopted for permanent records, then, as a director or as a senior leader, you may want to consider the higher standard for your records. And so I think it's one of those, it depends, but the answer is going to be based on how much information you're aware of regarding records safeguarding.
So it depends, but you're going to have to deal with it at some point.
You're going to have to deal with all of it. I mean, you deal with all of it, or, something happens, it's interesting because people say, I just don't have time for it. I've got other, mission critical things. Like, well, think about it. Because if something happens, we always did, those of us around the Beltway always did the Washington Post test. What if something happens that gets you on the front page of the Post? Is it really that important? But this is, again, and I know that I'm harping on risk management, but again, I think incorporating records management as part of internal controls and using risk management to justify the actions and initiatives is very important.
And that's, I think, that's a really good concept for people to keep in mind, because it elevates the records function. X people care about the records function. A much larger set of people care about the risk function. And if you can somehow move the conversation up into risk, I think that's a pretty useful thing to think about. There was a question early on about what I call the elusive big buckets question. Any tips that you have for people to, as they try to think about this infinite set of records retention schedules, to moving things into a fewer number of better managed buckets, how to go about that?
Yeah, so
she says skeptically.
You know what it is? I think about when I was involved in a large scale effort to take over 1,200 record items and synthesize those and get them down to something more manageable. I was very, very fortunate to have amazing people that knew a lot more about records management than I'll ever know. but it's getting past the I'm special and I need my own record schedule. No, that big bucket schedule doesn't really address my records. And then you find yourself trying to take this huge number of records, create the big buckets and get them down into, major categories, but always having these stakeholders come back and say, no, I need my own. So I think it's really getting people to understand what big bucket record scheduling means, and also looking at do the NARA GRS, do those schedules really apply to your organization? Because you are going to have some unique records. It's just you got to get away from the I'm special and all of a sudden you have 20 more records that technically could fit into one or two buckets.
So you mentioned at one point along the way, redundant, obsolete, and trivial and transitory records, and removing those, to kind of clean things up. The question that if those are in a digital records repository, do you recommend moving them to another location or getting rid of them entirely?
I want to make sure I'm understanding the question.
So the person said, are you saying remove rot records from digital records repositories? And do you recommend storing them someplace else or keeping them as records?
So what I'm saying is remove duplicates. So when a record is created, the record owner is responsible for maintaining and safeguarding that record until it's eligible for disposition, right? But as we were moving through digitizing and trying to meet the NARA requirements, what I was seeing across several organizations was, all right, everybody, start digitizing, get them into some system, get rid of paper. And then at the end of December, yeah, we got rid of so much. I'm like, yeah, now you have 7 copies of one record. You have to go back and look at your records. How many copies of the same records do you have across the organization? You should have one record, because if you have 6 other convenience copies, those are not the records, those are convenience copies. Now, if there's a bona fide business need to have those, that's fine, but you have to keep in mind they're FOIA-able. And so if a FOIA request comes in and they go to the record owner, they're also going to go to anybody else that has a convenience copy. And so think about a record that has a 5-year disposition, 10 years down the road, here comes a FOIA request. The record owner can say, we disposed of that within the approved record schedule, but there are 5 other copies floating around. Those are FOIA-able, and you're going to have to pull those as part of the response to the FOIA request. So the rot records really are dealing with, redundant duplicate copies. If records were digitized that were not even needed, they were way past the retention disposition period, get rid of them unless there's a bona fide business need.
And I do know from the private sector, there was a lot of research done on this, is that, and believe it or not, is that when people looked at the whole volume of stuff that they were saving, not necessarily just records, but the whole volume of information that they were saving in large organizations, 60% tended to be rot. So, so there's a lot of possibility there. You mentioned just in the answer to the question just a second before, there was a follow-up that somebody wanted. What's the definition of a record owner? Is it the person who initiates the record, the last signer, somebody who oversees it? Who is that person?
That's a great question. I mean, the person who creates the record and manages the record. Now, you could have a record creator that gives the record to someone else and actually transfers ownership of that record to the individual or office. Then that office takes responsibility of that record. It becomes their record. And I think this is where it gets confusing because let's say in the area of budget, there's a budget analyst that's putting together, a budget report. And so if they create that record and as budget analysts, they're responsible for that, but they give it to, your program director. This is information for your awareness or maybe your action. The creator, that budget analyst, the record belongs to that budget analyst. He might be sharing the information, but it's also a good example of where you create records, because the assistant to the program director says, oh, I've got this budget report, I'm going to digitize it now. If you need it, if there's a bona fide need for it, but your budget analyst has that document for you. So again, when it comes to ownership, it depends. Think about creating the record and managing the record.
Awesome. There's about 10 minutes left. So one thing I'd like to ask the attendees to do, let's see if we can blow up the question and answer button at this point, is I'd like to ask you guys I'm in the process of thinking about what the next set of these workshops is going to be on. So if you could just go into I wish we had the chat button open, but we don't. We just have the Q&A button open. So maybe just do it there. Just put in 3, 4, 5 words of major questions or major pain points that you have in your organization. And that will help Katy and I think about what some of the next topics are that we ought to explore, and just, blow it up. Just, everybody just put their ideas here in there. And while you're doing that, I'll go back and ask some of these other questions that people ask. So one question had to do with FADGI requirements and this question of FADGI 3-star. And so that the question had to do with, well, what does this mean with regards to existing workstations and existing equipment? And that is a really good question, because if you've got a scanner that's 8 years old or 10 years old, or probably even 4 or 5 years old, it does not necessarily perform in a FADGI 3 capable way. And as far as I can tell, the answer to the question of what do you do about that is still a TBD when it comes to NARA and when it comes to what happens moving forward. So I wish I had a better answer to that, but that's the answer that I've been given, is that people don't quite know what that means in terms of new. I mean, it's a great opportunity for scanner companies to sell you new stuff. But some of these things are pretty expensive stuff, and you can do some, modifications of existing equipment to meet the standards, but not every piece of equipment is going to be able to meet the standards.
Yeah, people need to understand, that scanner and the bells of, your building that have been sitting, 95% chance it's not FADGI compliant. And so, we have access to people who are very, very familiar with FADGI. And I'm not saying that in a sales kind of way, but I think it's really difficult to understand what the FADGI requirements are. And we can always provide some additional, resources for you to learn more about that if you'd like.
Awesome. Couple more questions, and thank you, Catherine, for answering Portland's question for me. You saved me asking that. Questions up here. Just hold on one second.
A lot of questions. I should have just cut short my presentation. We could have done.
No, these are great. These are great. It also gives us some ideas for future ones. This question of designated records custodians and records liaison officers. Most of these are bolt-on duties to what they actually do in real life. What do people do about this? In terms of that notion of getting a seat at the table, if people view this as a bolt-on, certainly there's a change management issue that people have to address that. But what in the real world, any thoughts on how people can deal with that?
It's funny because I was in administration, and so I would work with administrative officers, records people, privacy, management analysts. And it was interesting that a lot of the management analysts or administrators would come to me and say, oh, I'm the records, representative, and then I'm a privacy person. I'm the delegations of authority rep. I'm the policy contact. So there are a million ancillary duties. And I think that having that communication piece that I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, it's the engagement. It's understanding that a lot of offices are not going to have dedicated records people, but it's too much for the records officer to take everything on. OPM came out with the fly sheet and ultimately a series, I think it's 308 for records professionals. And I think, you know, if you're heavily involved in records, and it depends where the records office resides in your agency. It could be part of IT, it could be part of FOIA, it could be with the privacy group. But you really have to just try to bring those people into information sessions and just touch on various aspects of privacy until they start to get it and realize that they're not just a rep with ancillary duty, they're a critical part of success to the organization.
So realizing that you're not speaking for any particular agency, but relative to what you just said about where records responsibility lies, whether it's in privacy, whether it's IT, but whether it's in FOIA, if you could wave your magic wand, where would you put it?
I think it depends on the agency.
Yep.
You know, it's aligning all of those things, which is why the code, I'm so distracted by this one question about how do you contact the masses? I love this. You know, honestly, people, when I talk to people about records management, and I was a division director, I ran records management and privacy and policy, and I would go to the upper echelon and say, okay, we have a requirement, records very important, we need this, another unfunded requirement's come back. Okay, well, you know what, we have some real problems. Or am I going to NARA jail? I was like, I don't know, it's the law. You want to abide by the law, it's a requirement, it's a reg. You tell me. And finally, I thought, okay, to answer the question about how you get out to the masses, yes, you have to do the training, and it's got to be mandatory training. Yes, I understand people are clicking the button, but you make them click that button every year. And then you have the outreach, you have the engagement, you use risk management to get the resources to get things done. And then bring subject matter experts in. I never thought, you know, when I started working with records management, I didn't think it would be fun. This is horrible. It's like, yeah, it actually is kind of fun. It's interesting. There's a lot going on.
So I've lost the context a little bit for this question, but I apologize that I didn't get to it earlier, but I believe it refers to your kind of next steps on that second to last slide in the second bullet, when you talked about internal controls. And the question had to do, and this is above my pay grade, you might know the answer to this, is that, are you referring to OMB Circular 8123 and the GAO Green Book to federal agencies, or what was the context for that?
Yeah, so, you know, the agencies do their risk management and risk inventories. But when you're looking at A123 in the Green Book, that's not really what I'm talking about. However, it's important for offices to have risk inventories in place. And some have it formally and some do not. But what gets rolled up to the agency level and then what is reported on an annual basis, it's not going to capture the risk areas that are at the office level. But it's important to have risk inventory for records management in the agency. You just never know what's going to be. If you've got your top 3 risks regarding records management at the agency level, that's a great tool for the records officer to use. But if you're an administrative person working in an office and you are aware that they're putting their office risk inventory together, get a seat at the table. See if records management is part of the risk. Maybe you can be successful in adding a risk area to their inventory.
Awesome. I'm going to ask you, Katy, just to put you on the spot in a few minutes for kind of a final parting thought. But while you think about that, let me give you mine. And while I'm giving you mine, everybody, last chance to pump in on those pain points. That what everybody's put in here has been super. Gives us a lot of stuff to talk about moving forward. So my takeaway that I want people to stay with, and it has to do with some of Dennis's comments and Thomas and some of the other folks in there, is that I've done a lot of surveys over the years about records and about information management. And I've asked probably 1,000 people of all different stripes over the last few years, 2 questions. I've said, okay, look at the volume of information, electronic information coming into your organization right now, and call that X. And just speculate on what you think that volume will be 2 to 3 years from now. And the answer almost always comes back within the range of 3.5 to 4x what it is now. Okay, that's tip 1 of business as usual can't apply moving forward. Second question I ask people is, what volume of this stuff is unstructured information as opposed to semi-structured, like an invoice, for example, or totally structured, like data in a database. And they usually come back with 50 to 60%. So you put those 2 together, and at least for me, and it's just such a big challenge that organizations have to deal with, is that records management cannot be viewed any longer as a bolt-on that you do as a sideline of your current jobs. It can't be something that you put off to do like downstream, or else you'll just drown. You just will not recover from that influx of information. And that has to be addressed, at the top levels within organization, so that when you think about records management, you think about how you ingrain it into other systems and other processes and other things, rather than a standalone. That's my speech for the day. That's my sermon. So Katy, you go ahead.
And I think it's the little things that go a long way. I know I'm working with an organization, with an agency right now, one of their institutes, to help develop a records management program. So I've gone out to the scientific managers to say, can I just get half an hour in one of your staff meetings? Records management, 30 minutes, give me 30 minutes. There has never been a presentation where they haven't either asked me to come back, or it goes far beyond 30 minutes. And I think the engagement piece, the awareness piece, and you have to speak in a way that's relevant to them and to what they're doing. I think that's where people will get more engaged with records management.
So thank you so much, Katy. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of this workshop. Also, particularly thanks some of the folks that did us a favor and answered and commented on some of the questions on their own. That's actually, to be absolutely honest, that's a functionality within Zoom that I didn't quite know existed. So that's an awesome thing, because I think one of the things that I like to do is really tap into the knowledge of the community and helping answer some of these questions. So thank you for that. Our next session, I believe, is going to be on August 16th. I need to check the date. It will be with Jesse Wilkins, who will talk about some of the greatest mistakes people make in their electronic records management programs. Jesse is a lovable curmudgeon, so you'll have a good time listening to Jesse, because he's always pretty provocative, and I've known him for a long time. So again, thank you all very much. Katy, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks.
The Q&A part is amazing. I mean, people really are engaged. I appreciate that.
And thanks QAI for giving us kind of this free mic. We really appreciate it. So thanks so much, everybody.
Take care.